Queen Victoria was only 18 years old when she became Queen of Britain. She was young, but she was determined. For most of her childhood, Victoria had lived under strict rules. Her mother watched her closely. Powerful advisors tried to control her future. So when Victoria finally became queen, she wanted one thing more than anything else: freedom. She moved into Buckingham Palace. She began making her own decisions. And she quickly discovered that being queen was not simply about wearing a crown. Every decision was being judged. Every friendship was being watched. And every mistake could become a national scandal. Then Prince Albert arrived from Germany. He was Victoria's cousin. He was intelligent, educated, ambitious, and very different from the people around her. Victoria was immediately attracted to him. But falling in love was not simple. Victoria was the queen. Albert would become her husband. And everyone wanted to know who would control the royal household. Victoria had spent her childhood fighting for independence. She did not want a husband who would control her. But Albert did not want to take her crown. He wanted to stand beside her. Victoria slowly began to trust him. And then she made an unexpected decision. She proposed to Albert herself. They married in 1840. At first their relationship was passionate. But marriage soon revealed their differences. Victoria was emotional and fiercely independent. Albert was calm, disciplined, and determined. They argued over politics. They argued over royal responsibilities. But slowly Albert became more than Victoria's husband. He became her closest advisor, her trusted partner, and the person she depended on most. Together they began building a family. Together they began changing the British monarchy. But Victoria never imagined that one day she would have to face life without him. Because the greatest tragedy of her life was still waiting for her. Victoria and Albert had now begun a new life together. They were young. They were deeply in love. And they were surrounded by everything that came with being part of the British royal family. But behind the beautiful palace walls, their marriage was not always peaceful. Victoria was the queen. She had been raised to believe that the crown was her responsibility. Every decision mattered. Every political problem eventually came to her desk. Albert slowly realized that loving Victoria also meant understanding the enormous pressure she carried. Albert wanted to help her. He was intelligent and well educated. He had studied politics, science, art, music, and history. He believed that the monarchy could become stronger if it changed with the times. But Victoria did not always agree with him. She could become angry when Albert tried to influence her decisions. Sometimes their arguments became intense. Victoria wanted Albert to understand that she was the monarch. Albert wanted Victoria to understand that he was not simply a husband standing quietly beside her. He wanted to become useful. He wanted to contribute. And slowly Victoria began to realize that Albert was not trying to take her crown. He was trying to protect it. Albert became involved in the running of the royal household. He helped organize Victoria's schedule. He encouraged her interest in education and science. He supported new ideas. And he became increasingly involved in public life. Their family also began to grow. Their first daughter Victoria was born in 1840. Then came Albert Edward, Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, and Beatrice. 9 children in total. The royal family became one of the most famous families in Europe. Victoria loved being a mother. But motherhood also brought new challenges. Albert became deeply involved in the children's education. He wanted them to be disciplined, responsible, intelligent, and prepared for their future roles. Victoria sometimes felt that Albert was too strict. Albert sometimes felt that Victoria was too emotional. They disagreed about their children. They disagreed about politics. And they disagreed about the royal household. But despite their arguments, something powerful was happening. They were becoming a team. Albert was becoming the person Victoria trusted most. When Victoria faced a difficult political decision, she often turned to Albert. When she was angry with a minister, she spoke to Albert. When she was uncertain about her public responsibilities, she looked to Albert for advice. He became her closest companion. And this was important because Victoria often felt lonely even when surrounded by people. The British public saw a powerful queen. But Albert saw the woman behind the crown. He knew her fears. He knew her temper. He knew her dreams. And he understood the pressure she carried. Their marriage was becoming stronger. But Victoria was also becoming more dependent on Albert. She believed he would always be there. She believed they would grow old together. She had no idea how quickly everything could change. As the years passed, Victoria and Albert became one of the most famous royal couples in Europe. Their children were growing up. Their influence was expanding. And Albert was becoming increasingly important to the British monarchy. He supported education, science, technology, art, and public institutions. He believed Britain could become a leader in modern progress. The Great Exhibition of 1851 became one of his greatest achievements. Thousands of people came to London. They came to see machines, new inventions, scientific discoveries, art, and industrial achievements. Albert helped organize the event. At first some people doubted him. But the exhibition became a huge success. The public began to respect him. He was no longer simply the foreign prince who had married the Queen. He was becoming an important figure in Britain. Victoria was proud of him. She trusted him. And she depended on his advice. But Albert's responsibilities were becoming enormous. He worked constantly. He read political documents. He advised Victoria. He helped manage the royal household. And he remained deeply involved in the education of their children. Victoria sometimes worried that he worked too hard. But Albert believed that duty came before comfort. He wanted to make a difference. He wanted to leave something meaningful behind. Meanwhile, Europe was changing. Political tensions were growing. Revolutions had changed European countries. New ideas were spreading. And royal families were becoming increasingly connected. Victoria and Albert knew that their children would eventually become part of this complicated world. Their daughters would marry foreign princes. Their sons would take important positions. And their family would become connected to royal houses across Europe. Victoria dreamed of a powerful royal family. Albert shared many of those hopes. But behind the public success, their private life remained deeply important. They walked together. They traveled together. They spent time with their children. They wrote letters when they were apart. And they created a private world inside the enormous public world of the monarchy. For Victoria, Albert was becoming impossible to replace. She had ministers, servants, officials, and advisors. But Albert was the one person who truly understood her. He knew the woman behind the Queen. He knew when she was frightened. He knew when she was angry. And he knew when she needed support. Then something began to change. Albert's health was no longer perfect. At first it seemed like exhaustion. He was working too much. He was carrying too many responsibilities. Victoria became concerned. She wanted him to rest. But Albert continued working. He did not want to stop. He believed his duty was more important than his comfort. Then in 1861 his health became seriously worse. Victoria was terrified. She stayed close to him. She hoped the doctors could help. She hoped he would recover. She believed they still had many years together. But the Queen, who had survived political crises, could not control what was happening. Albert was becoming weaker. And Victoria was beginning to understand that she might lose the person she loved most. In December 1861, Prince Albert became seriously ill. Victoria stayed beside him. She watched over him. She refused to leave him. She hoped that he would recover. But his condition continued to worsen. The doctors could do very little. Victoria could hardly accept what was happening. For more than 20 years, Albert had been beside her. He had been her husband, her advisor, her closest friend, and the father of their children. Now he was dying. On December 14, 1861, Prince Albert died. He was only 42 years old. Victoria was completely devastated. The woman who had once been one of the most powerful people in the world was suddenly helpless. She had lost the person she trusted most. Victoria went into deep mourning. She wore black. She withdrew from public life. She spent long periods away from London. She could not accept that Albert was gone. She preserved his rooms, his clothes, his personal belongings. Everything remained carefully maintained. It was almost as though she was waiting for him to return. But he never did. Victoria's grief became so powerful that the British public began to worry. Some people criticized her absence. They believed the Queen had a duty to appear in public. But they did not understand her pain. Victoria had not simply lost a husband. She had lost her closest companion. She had lost the person who had helped her make decisions. She had lost the person who knew her better than anyone else. Years passed. But Victoria continued to mourn. She kept photographs of Albert. She remembered his advice. She spoke about him. And she tried to protect his memory. She wanted the world to understand how important Albert had been. She supported monuments and projects connected to his name. She wanted history to remember him as the man who helped strengthen the British monarchy. But Victoria herself had changed. She became more isolated, more private, and more protective of her family. Her children tried to help her. But no one could replace Albert. The Queen, who had once wanted complete independence, now wished more than anything that she could have the man beside her again. But life continued. Britain continued to change. The empire expanded. Industry grew. Science developed. Technology changed everyday life. Victoria eventually returned to public life. But she was never the same woman again. She remained devoted to Albert's memory. She continued to rule. And she continued the work they had started together. She could not bring Albert back. But she could carry his memory with her. She could protect the family they had created. And she could continue to serve as queen. Even while carrying a private grief that never completely disappeared. The years after Albert's death transformed Queen Victoria. She continued to rule Britain. But she never stopped mourning the man she had loved. Albert's memory remained everywhere. In the palaces. In the photographs. In the monuments. And in the family they had created together. Victoria kept his rooms carefully maintained. She wanted everything to remain as it had been when he was alive. She remembered his advice. She remembered his voice. And she continued to imagine what he might have said about the problems of the day. Her children eventually married into royal families across Europe. Victoria became known as the grandmother of Europe. Her family became connected to many royal houses. Their influence spread across the continent. But Europe was changing. Political tensions were growing. Nationalism was becoming stronger. And the royal family Victoria had worked so hard to build would eventually become connected to some of the greatest conflicts of the 20th century. Victoria herself would not live to see all of those changes. She remained queen for decades. Her reign became one of the longest in British history. An entire period of British history became known as the Victorian Age. Britain became more industrial. Cities expanded. Science developed. Technology changed. And the British Empire grew enormously. Victoria became a symbol of the age. But behind the powerful public image there was still a woman who missed Albert. She had never stopped loving him. She had never remarried. And she never allowed the world to forget him. On January 22, 1901, Queen Victoria died. She was 81 years old. She had ruled Britain for more than 63 years. She had experienced love, marriage, motherhood, political conflict, family tragedy, and deep personal loss. She had started her reign as an 18-year-old girl, and she had become one of the most recognizable monarchs in history. But when Victoria died, the story of her marriage to Albert remained one of the most important parts of her legacy. Their marriage had not been perfect. They had argued. They had disagreed. They had struggled to understand each other. But they had built something powerful. They had become partners. They had created a family. And they had changed the image of the British monarchy. Victoria began her reign believing that she needed to stand alone. Albert showed her that strength could also come from partnership. And when she lost him, she discovered how deeply he had become part of her identity. That is what makes their story so emotional. It was not simply a story about a queen and a prince. It was a story about two people who learned how to live together, how to disagree, how to support each other, how to build a family, and finally, how to survive loss. Victoria had the crown. Albert did not have a crown of his own. But together they created a legacy that lasted for generations. Victoria spent almost 40 years living without the man who had once been beside her every day. She never forgot him. She never stopped mourning him. And she never allowed the world to forget the role he had played in her life. Queen Victoria ruled an empire. But behind the crown was a woman who simply loved her husband. And when she lost him, even the most powerful woman in Britain could not command her heart to stop hurting. This was the story of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. A story of love, power, family, loss, and a legacy that survived for generations. Visit my YouTube channel Sleepless Historian for more emotional royal history stories. Like this story. Comment your thoughts. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about queens, kings, and the hidden lives behind history.